Today we're talking about DevSecOps, and I've always found this fascinating to look at the intersection of development, security, operations, how that plays together. Having been in IT and operations and software for my entire career, I really like this blending of technology. And my first question, I guess, for the panel is, how do we use DevSecOps? Is it for software that we create ourselves, largely create ourselves, obviously using components, right? So I have a custom application, or is it for I'm using some off the shelf, open source, or commercial software that I still need to deploy? How do we apply DevSecOps? Is it for both audiences?
I was actually going to say yes. In a lot of ways, I think that, it's funny, Paul. I remember on one of our shows a while back, I think we both agreed that DevSecOps doesn't exist. And this was an early episode of
Yes, we
Application
did say that.
Security Weekly. And then it became my title, and then I had to implement it at Thermo Fisher. And so
Right.
I think in a lot of ways, DevSecOps is just that process or that mentality of applying agile methods and DevOps processes to security in a lot of ways, right? So
Yep.
that's security for everything, things you build, things you buy, things you download from open source.
Hmm.
And a lot of it has to do with, at least today, is almost like asset management of your stack. But it can be ephemeral asset management as opposed to the physical devices in your racks that you got to go deal with, which I think is a good handoff to Chris, who is
Yeah.
definitely working toward solving that problem and how that applies then to tracking it all.
Right. Thinking of the analogy with client server. Back in the day, there was clients and there were servers, and then it started to blur. And is that a client, or is it a server? Is it a host? And what we find is the answer is yes and no and all the above. And as you're saying, Paul, in your intro about DevSecOps, is it a thing? Well, it's a thing that puts individual thoughts in an order. Development, security, operations, and runs them together so we think about it together. That's good. Like, there are, in fact, still clients and servers, and yes, they are quite often the same things, but we have to parse these things out, and they're the same thing. Whether it's operational information generated by using code, or the actual code itself, that I'm using to compile to make other code, or vulnerability notices about them, or whatnot. They each have a role. They each feed into each other, and we're getting to this point, I think, in the industry where our opportunity to merge them for practical purposes is substantial. So it's a
It,
fascinating
it
time.
it's interesting, Chris and Keith, both you're making me think about the number of different components that I have when I'm deploying a solution. And you end up with, in each solution that you're trying to deploy, you have lots of different components. I mean, this could be, I'm trying to deploy Office 365. It's completely someone else's software. I'm just using it, all the way down to I've got my custom application, and everywhere in between. I end up with all these various components. And I think a good aspect of DevSecOps is understanding all the components you have, making them work together, and also securely. What are some tips that you folks have for understanding what components you have in these different scenarios?
So I think that there are definitely tools out there today that can help you get a handle on your open source and container exposure.
Hmm.
So there are a number of open source projects like the Open Web Application Security. I forget the name of the actual project now. Dependency Check. Excuse me,
Yeah,
Dependency Check.
yeah.
That's one that just comes to mind as. I think part of it, though, is a lot of people don't necessarily stop to consider like a manifest file for their applications, right?
Mhm.
So just thinking about what are all of the things that I'm pulling in as part of my core application so that I can now track them more readily. I mean, even open source platforms like GitHub will do that for you with Dependabot.
Mhm.
That tells you, hey, you've got a vulnerable version of a bit of software in here. Please go ahead and update. And then you can just auto create a pull request and then merge it right in, and you're good. Oh, you're good if you have good, checks for unit and integration tests to make sure that that thing didn't just break everything you were trying to do.
Right.
But I don't think that there's, as of yet, I'd say it's not a widely adopted practice. And I think that we're getting there. And thankfully, Chris and a number of people at the Linux Foundation are helping us get there.